All right. Hello, everybody. I'm here today with Professor Richard Rubenstein. He's a professor at George Mason University. He went to Harvard for undergrad and law school, I believe, and was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford too. I should say I went to Harvard for my master's degree. I have share a little bit of affinity for you that way too. But the main thing that I'm excited to talk to Dr. Richard Rubenstein about tonight is his book, When Jesus Became God, which is a book mainly focusing on the Arian conflict and the history of the church in the Roman Empire in the 4th century. And I will say it's extremely readable. It is very engaging and very exciting. And I think it's a period of history that modern people know way too little about. And the little that they do is often very polemical. And that I'm excited to get to talk to you tonight and hear more about it, and perhaps set the record straight on a couple things, but also talk about how some of the things that were going on then seem perhaps strangely relevant now too, and the lessons that we can learn from history. You specialize in conflict resolution and peaceful means of conflict resolution between groups who have different ideas, and that seems perhaps more useful than it has in a long time. So do you want to give any other further?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about it. I had started out in life in my professional life as a lawyer, and and fell out of love with that after a while, and really wanted to try to learn something and do something about these conflicts that some people call intractable.
Yes.
That are difficult conflicts because they're conflicts, social conflicts and ideological conflicts of a kind that aren't easily resolved through bargaining, through the kind of normal types of dispute resolution that our system is built to handle. And so it's really interesting to be talking about this now, also because we're in a period of our own history when conflicts that we thought would be manageable through the kind of normal system procedures are not.
Yeah.
And they're producing all sorts of problems in our own country and elsewhere.
Yeah.
So I got involved in this because I wanted to see, in particular, why a conflict that seemed to be in some ways involved kind of hair-splitting theological differences.
Yeah.
And who cares really? We're not considered hair-splitting at all, but we're considered vital, and produced conflicts in the 4th century AD that involved cities being burned down and people getting assassinated, and gang fights in the streets, and a lot of civil violence.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it becomes more and more important, I think, for us to try to determine what's behind these conflicts that seem to have the potential to produce violence.
Yeah.
Even though a detached observer might say, "What are they arguing about? What's the difference? What are they arguing about?"
Right.
Right. So in this case, what they were arguing about was, in some ways, a very technical kind of conflict, was the relationship between Jesus the Son and God the Father. The people who were arguing about it were Christians. They weren't Christians and non-Christians. They were all Christians. And now that that conflict theologically has been worked out in such a way that there are winners and losers. And the winners were people basically who believed in a Trinitarian conception of God. And the losers were people who, I can talk about this in a second, but who didn't for one reason or
Mm-hmm.
another. Now it seems that, the conflict, people might say the conflict was about nothing, or it was about something trivial. But it was desperately important to the people who were involved in it at that time. And that's what most interests me, is why people can get so involved, how people get so involved in conflicts that seem simply ideological,
Mm-hmm.
that they can risk their own lives and take lives, even because of how passionately they feel about it. And when people look back at the Arian Controversy, which was this fight in the 4th century between people who thought that Jesus was God incarnate, God on earth, and people who thought that he was the Son of God, but inferior in some ways to God. I mean, that was the struggle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even now, when you talk about it, you say, what on earth were they arguing about? How could they burn down Constantinople?
Yeah.
Over a conflict that seems this, in some ways unimportant.
Mm-hmm.
And then you realize someday people are going to look back on us and say, wait a minute, why were these people so excited about gun control?
Yeah. Or all lives
Or
matter versus Black Lives Matter. Like what, what's that? What was that about?
Exactly.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, it's a really interesting subject, and it's not that well understood either by me or by anybody else, about how these differences of theological opinion and really an ethical opinion about values, get to be so charged that they can, generate this kind of conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll blither on if you want me
Yeah,
to.
well, sure. Well, so let's start at, in some sense, I guess, the beginning of the 4th century. So Diocletian is the emperor. He has made something of a heroic attempt to reunify the empire and to reorganize its economics, its military, its finances, its politics, and in some sense to try and revive religion. And he is worried about the influence of this Christian religion that seems to be growing. Paganism is still dominant, both politically and by numbers, but Christianity is ascendant. And so this is sort of the state of things in the beginning. And I think part of the reason, like, Christians had theological squabbles before. The Christians had called other sorts of Christians heretics, and there had been councils and things that met either locally or regionally that had, criticized someone's opinion this way or the other way. But Christianity had been a mutually persecuted religion, right? And so they weren't going to go fight each other in the streets when they were both worried about the empire fighting them. Does that seem sort of right? What's sort of the state, I guess, of Christianity right around 300 AD?
Yes, I think that's quite accurate. That's right. And you say there are a couple of things that are very interesting about that, and also relevant maybe to what we're going through now. One is that the period involved an empire in trouble. And so there's a tendency, you're thinking about these things. If you think about these things in modern terms, in terms of, well, here's the state's over here, the church is over here, and, the public. No. In fact, when the state is in enough trouble, this also involves people's personal beliefs and people's, religious affiliations. And so you begin to get a battle in the early centuries of Christianity. You got a big battle between Romans, who realize that their empire is having problems, some serious problems, even before Diocletian, even some serious problems. And some of the Romans are saying, well, the problem is that we have these Christians and other people who don't believe in the old gods in the old way, and are not willing to participate in the kind of civil/religious ceremonies really that characterize that period. And so the gods are angry, and they're punishing them, and they're punishing us. But you have people on the other side are saying, wait a minute, these old gods are not protecting, they're not doing us any good. The values that they represent are outmoded. They're not protecting the empire. They're in fact weakening the empire. And the way to kind of revive the empire is to revive to kind of reconstruct its ideology, to revive its ideology.
Right. Ancient people, I think, very much viewed religion, and like they're not unsophisticated. They very much viewed that religion needed to be done properly as at the society and governmental level, and that secured divine favor, divine blessings, the right course of providence and stuff like that. And when things were going badly, that was interpreted that religion was probably one of the most likely causes of if things weren't going well, or when things go well, it was probably a sign that you were doing your religion correctly. And it's hard for us, I think, modern people to take that idea to imagine them taking that idea as seriously as they really did.
No, that's very well put. And the only thing I would say about it is kind of let's not put so much distance between us and the ancient people.
Yeah.
Because when things go badly for us, and they are at the moment going very badly, people won't say, as they did in the old days, they won't say the gods are angry. And most people, at least. Some people will.
Yeah.
But most people won't say the gods are angry. But they will say things like,
you're on the wrong side of history or something.
Yeah, or they will, for example, if you a lot of my friends and associates are anti-Trump. Okay, so you'll hear people who are anti-Trump in the current electoral fight and so forth say things like, well, it's partly because of the faults of character of the president. It's partly because of, they won't say the gods are angry, but they will say we've been kind of led into error, right? And ethical error, not just political error, but ethical error by bad leaders. And so we're going to have to pay a price for that. So they're not going to say the gods are angry and they're going to punish us, but they almost they're almost saying something like that.
Right. Or you could say with climate change, some people, it's the evils of capitalism or whatever that are causing us to exploit our environment, and Mother Nature is going to get back at us for it, exactly. Or something like that. It's a very similar sort of idea.
Yeah. So we have our own language, in which to express these fears and hopes and ideas. But I think that really kind of the basic idea that things are either going well for us or bad for us in a way that implicates our beliefs and our values.
Yes,
is something that we actually share with those people, because if you look at the Arian controversy, the controversy that I studied in this book, and this is a 4th century controversy, so the Christianity's been around already for a while, and it has just become the religion of the Roman Empire, the official religion of the Roman Empire. And when that happens, the Emperor Constantine thinks that by having Christianity become the religion of the Roman Emperor, it's going to basically save the empire, as well as save the individuals involved in the empire. It'll kind of give the empire the kind of ideological and moral glue that it needs to kind of become more, restore its confidence, and also restore its kind of historical is like make Rome great,
Make Rome great again.
Great again.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so you could imagine that, like, at the beginning of the 4th century, pagans are saying we need to get rid of all these non-pagan religions who are dishonoring the gods, not doing the rites properly. And then there's the other side. Well, wait a minute, what have the pagan gods done for us recently? Maybe the problem is paganism itself.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Very well put. Exactly. And then, of course, what makes it so fascinating is that, we're talking about the 4th century, and we have this controversy between Christians, and we have Constantine becoming the first Roman emperor who's a Christian. But not long after that, we have an attempt to revive paganism under Julian.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Julian says, "Oh, the problem of all of these new religions are the problem. If we just do paganism right, we'll be able to get back to
right.
We'll be able to make Rome great again."
Mm-hmm.
So I think part of what we're dealing with is and we're dealing with it today too, is a kind of overlap between religious and cultural controversies and conflicts, and kind of geopolitical conflicts, which makes things really confusing.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if people don't want to recognize that they have an empire and it's in trouble.
Right.
And I have to say, although I'm not a great Trump fan, Trump actually recognizes that. I mean, in a sense, some of his people do, that
mm-hmm.
the kind of endless wars and so forth that America's been involved in are not doing us any good.
Mm-hmm. So I guess one tact for this conversation, to tell the story a little bit. So who was Arius, and what were his ideas? And so what's sort of like the early stage of the theological conflict sort of bubbling in the background before it really becomes full blown?
Well, the interesting thing about the Arian controversy, one of the interesting things about it is that the view that turned out to be orthodox, that's now identified among Christians as the Orthodox Trinitarian view, was actually originally the radical view. I mean, I think if you're going to have to pick who was the conservative in the Arian controversy, it was probably the Arians. Mm-hmm. I mean, these were people. Arius was a preacher and in Alexandria, a very actually distinguished priest who had come through the period of persecution of the Christians with flying colors, mm-hmm. and had a big reputation as having been a kind of hero, and resisting Roman persecution. And he turns out to be a priest at a very popular church in Alexandria. And Alexandria, by the way, people may not know this, but Alexandria was a city of 1 million people, mm-hmm. in the first 2nd century, 3rd century.
Yeah, it was bigger than Rome at the time. Yeah, and maybe even the biggest city or close to it.
It's true, and richer than Rome. I mean, more trade was going on there.
More educated, and
learning. That's right. The library, the great library of Alexandria, was there.
And a lot of the most famous philosophers of the period were from Alexandria or had studied there, and all that sort of thing.
That's right. And mm-hmm. I always think of when I think of Alexandria, I always think not only of the library, but of the lighthouse. Mm-hmm. And they, according to stories, we don't know how true they were at this point. I mean, it hasn't been verified, but hasn't been unverified either. There was a lens on, high up on Alexandria, where you could apparently look through the lens and see ships hundreds of miles out on the Mediterranean. They had some kind of magnifying glass.
Yeah, some sort of telescopy thingy. Yeah.
Anyway, it was really the center. It was one of the great centers of world culture.
Mm-hmm. So
Um,
this isn't starting in the hinterlands among hillbillies. This
uh,
is the opposite of that.
no, it's really the opposite of that. It's
Mm-hmm.
starting. It's starting in the part of the Roman Empire. It was the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire, which was the most culturally and economically developed. The western part, what we think of now as the Roman Empire, France and Germany and all of that, was just, that was the sticks
Yeah.
in those days. So that's where they started to have these great debates. And the initial debate was Arius said that he said Jesus Christ was a unique character in human history, the holiest man who ever lived, somebody worth glorifying and worth worshiping.
Mm-hmm.
But more than a prophet, even, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not more than Moses, more than Isaiah.
Mm-hmm.
With a uniquely holy person with a unique relationship with God. But he wasn't God.
Mm-hmm.
He was, he was the son of, according to Arius, he was the son of God. And one reason I think that idea resonated with a lot of people, especially in the east part of the Roman Empire, in the Holy Land, in Syria, in Lebanon, places like that, was that they had become entirely used to the idea that you could have a supreme leader, who in Roman times they would call Augustus, and a leader almost as supreme as him, but not quite,
Mm-hmm.
who would be called Caesar or something else.
Yeah.
And both of them, the Augustus and the Caesar, were miles above the common people in terms of status, in terms of power, and all of that. But they were not identical.
Right.
So one reason that I think
and that pattern sort of like you see that going back with Julius Caesar and his relation to Octavian, Augustus, and stuff like that, where there was sort of the power or glory behind the throne, and then there was like the active person who kind of did a lot of the action and dirty work and real business, but was sort of the representative of the higher power above him. And I think for a lot of early Christians, that was the analogy that made the most sense to them for the relationship between Jesus and God. He was the Son of God, which means he had the authority and sort of the glory of his Father upon him. If you disrespected him, that was like disrespecting his Father. But he was still subordinate and had his allegiance to his Father, and his power wasn't intrinsic to himself; it was derived.
Exactly right. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So, so the Arians asserted that, and it was not, for some people, especially in the eastern part of the empire, that wasn't shocking at all. It seemed to be, everybody said, yeah, that's what we meant by, if you ask Romans, like, what's the difference between a father and a son? That, come on.
Mm-hmm.
They would say, well, of course the father is superior to the son.
Yeah.
Actually, the father in Roman culture, the father had life and death power over his family, including his son.
Mm-hmm.
But now comes along a radical group, and I don't say that to to put them down. At all. I'm a radical too. I don't put them down. But people who ended up being led by Athanasius, the great and great and very controversial bishop of Alexandria. And let me just say, note this as we go along. You know this, but make sure other people do. Is that these guys, Athanasius and other bishops in the period, the bishop of Antioch, the bishop of Constantinople, the bishop of Rome, the bishop of a few places, they were all called Pope.
Mm-hmm.
They were called Papa
Mm-hmm.
because they were enormously powerful authorities, both controlling both religious and secular goodies, in their
Right.
jurisdictions. And there was no Pope in Rome who was supreme over everybody. That was still in the future.
Yeah, a pope was like a bishop of bishops, right? It was sort of like in early Christianity, bishops were, sort of the person in charge of the churches in a geographical area or a city. But then once Christianity starts getting bigger and bigger and more developed, and there's these super cities like Alexandria, you need more bishops than just one. So you have lots of bishops in the city and then the hinterlands around it. And then there's this new level of the hierarchy that's starting to emerge around this time called a pope, which was,
That's right.
And it wasn't just the one in Rome. Catholics, you can argue about that, but
the metropolitan bishop or what have you, but they were enormously powerful figures.
Mm-hmm.
And also for that reason, by the way, when we talk about conflicts in this era between what the Bishop of Rome believed this and the Bishop of Alexandria believed that, this was also partly a kind of geographical, or today we would say national, but there were no nations yet. But it was a conflict for status and power between Alexandria and Rome and Antioch and Jerusalem, and other places. So when you look back at it now, you see along comes Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, and a few other people, and they're saying, now, wait a minute. The problem with saying that Jesus is the Son of God but not God, there are a number of problems with it. One problem with it is we believe that because of Christ's arrival and life and death and resurrection, that he conquered sin and death. And so how can he do that if he's actually isn't acting as God, if he doesn't have, he isn't fully divine? And so that's one issue. Second issue is that they say if Jesus isn't God himself in a different form, or in an incarnate form, what is he?
Yeah.
In the pagan era, everybody believed that there were demons and there were this, that, and the other thing. You could be a demigod. And, so a figure like Hercules was supposed to be the offspring of a god and a human.
Right.
So you could look at the Christian story, the Jesus birth story, and if you wanted to, and say, well, God somehow fathered a child on Mary, and the result was a demigod. The result was one of these sort of pagan half-god creatures. And so people like Athanasius are saying, well, we don't believe that. I mean, we're not going for that. And
angel didn't seem quite enough either, right? In the Jewish toolkit, there was God, and maybe he was the God of gods. There was maybe this host of other, Elohim that he was over, and there was angels, and there was something of a hierarchy there, but it didn't seem like there was any natural fit of what if Jesus pre-existed his human existence in some sense,
right?
But he wasn't God himself, or somehow a member of the Godhead. It didn't seem like there was a proper rung in the hierarchy to put him on. That's
exactly right. And Peter Brown, the great historian of Christianity at Princeton, keeps saying, and I think he's absolutely right, that everybody wasn't Jews and Christians and everybody and pagans for that matter in the ancient world. Everybody believed it wasn't just a matter of God. There's God and there's everything else. There was this spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
a kind of as you say, hierarchy, a ladder,
a heavenly bureaucracy.
Yeah, all sorts of intermediary creatures, intermediary between. So Athanasius is maybe his strongest point. Was saying, wait a minute, are you saying that Jesus is just another intermediary? And if not, then how do you describe his relationship with God? I mean, because the Arians, and this got tricky because the Arians didn't think he was just another intermediary either.
Mm-hmm.
They believed he was sitting at the right hand of God after his resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
They believe he was adopted by God as his son, which God hadn't done with anybody before. So anyway, so there's well, what do we think about it? And I think when you try to translate this into sort of more earthly terms and more kind of political terms, then it seems to be that there are certain groups in society, certain priests, like Athanasius, but also certain groups that really need to have Jesus be on the same rank of God and the same need him to be God for reasons we can talk about, and others who are saying they don't really want him to be God. They want him to be more, in a sense, more reachable.
Mm-hmm.
That I think probably the main appeal that the Arians had in this controversy was to people who wanted to see Jesus as a kind of elder brother, or somebody who they could identify with and imitate, somebody who might even intercede for them with God if it came to Judgment Day,
mm-hmm.
and who wasn't already up there on the throne with God. Mm-hmm. Somebody closer to being human.
Right. If Satan is your prosecutor, right? If Satan is the attorney against you, then Jesus is your defense attorney, right? The one arguing on your side before the throne, right? And it's his righteousness, it's his standing with God that can get you on the good side of God with him, right? That's sort of the metaphor. I think that Arianism or a Christology that has Jesus as more on the side of humans really than on the side of God, that's a metaphor that makes a lot of sense.
That's right. And I think that's also a reason why when the Arians lost this fight, at least at that time, although Arianism kind of keeps cropping up again
mm-hmm.
in later centuries, but when they lost this fight, that really produced, after a while, the cult of Mary.
Yeah.
And the idea that Mary, if Jesus couldn't intervene in that way for you, Mary could.
Right. And she as only a mom can get his attention for you, right? And tug on him and have him focus on yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So in the book that I wrote about this that you know very well, I sort of ended up thinking, well, if you were in the group of, if you were a Roman at a time and you thought basically the Roman Empire was probably going to be okay, and especially if you were a member of a society where people were doing fairly well, and they were kind of optimistic about their material prospects and about their political prospects, then you might also say, we want this Jesus, who is not necessarily God himself, to be for us an object of glorification, of worship, that we want to be like him. And we can be like him because we could transform our own lives. I mean, Christianity made such tremendous progress in the Roman Empire, partly originally because it held out to people the possibility that they could become way better than they had been before as people, as and that they could change themselves in ways that hadn't been thought, it wasn't thought to be realistic before. And if you look at Paul, I'm studying Paul at the moment. I'm doing a book on Paul.
Yeah.
And if you look at Paul, I mean, that's part of what Paul's message is to the congregations that he's talking about is you're free in the sense that you're not necessarily bound by all of the restrictions of Jewish law, but also you're not bound to, you don't have to be Romans like all the other Romans, you can be a new kind of person. And that's what Christianity is offering you, and still offers people, Christianity and some other religions, offer people the possibility to really change the way that they live, change the way that they behave, and change the way that they think. So that's it's just a thrilling possibility, and I think that as that possibility became less realistic to people who were living through the last years of Rome, the last centuries of Rome, and as things kind of got more and more grim in various ways for the empire, people started to think, listen, we're not going to be able to transform ourselves like this. We'll be lucky just to survive in some kind of minimally decent way. And for that, we need a strong church, and we need a strong sense of our own sinfulness, and we need a Jesus who will be at God's right hand, and not, we're not going to be, a few of us will try to imitate him, and they will be monks or
saints
or something. But most of us won't be able to do it. So I think that the defeat of Arianism is really part of this.
That there are these larger kind of psychological and social forces, combining together that sort of help drive it beyond just sort of a random coin flip of which side won. That Arianism, or just the idea that Jesus is something more imitatable, right, is something of an optimistic thought, and seemed to do well in the optimistic, more having a higher view of human nature, perhaps, in the more successful period of the empire. But as history got darker, perhaps the negative view of what was attainable for humans was part of why Jesus being more on the God side made it work a little bit better. And I think another reason that I often think is tied to this is that I think that Trinitarianism favors a certain clericalism, right? A stronger divide between the clergy, the priestly class, and the laity, and that sort of mirrors the stronger divide between Jesus and humanity. And that as the church was entering the darker ages, that a church that was more clerical was somehow able to endure the decline of civilization better than perhaps one that was a little bit less clerical, a little bit more optimistic about individuals in the church's ability to improve.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the central figure in that development is Augustine.
Yeah.
I mean, the city of God just says what you just said. It said that's what it said.
Yeah. So, and that combining of a heavier emphasis on original sin and stuff like that. So before we skip ahead of in talking about a very important historical thing that a lot of people don't understand, I want to talk about the Council of Nicaea and what it was and what it wasn't. And so we've set the background pretty well, that Arius is this priest in Alexandria, and he has this view that Jesus is the Son of God, but not equal to God himself. And there's Alexander and Athanasius, who Alexander is the bishop at the time, and Athanasius is his young up-and-coming protege. And they are more on the side of Jesus is equal to and on the same standing as the Father, really. And so Arius gets excommunicated, and then Arius was a well-connected guy, it sounds like, and he phones a lot of his friends, and there are bishops scattered throughout the empire, but especially in like Turkey and Syria, that are on his side. And Alexander and Athanasius, they have their constellation of allies, and it seems shockingly evenly matched from the get-go. And the Emperor Constantine is just on his rise into power, just now able to consolidate his power and trying to make Christianity not exactly the state religion, but the favored religion. And he becomes aware of this conflict. So what was sort of the purpose of the Council of Nicaea, and what did it achieve, I guess?
Well, I mean, what you said was a perfect, was a beautiful description of the of what led up to it. Constantine's own Christianity has always been a little, it's been debatable in some ways.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that. Yeah.
I mean, Constantine was a believer in Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. So he believed in a high God, basically the sun god.
Yeah. So he was a monotheist before he was a Christian. I think a lot of people don't know that was possible at the time, but he was a pagan monotheist.
But that was because everybody likes to think that that sort of either Judaism or Christianity sort of invented monotheism single-handedly. But in fact, in pagan society was moving in that direction, and there were other religions too that were monotheistic. But among Romans, the idea that there was a high God and a really high God had really taken hold. So he thought, Sol Invictus, so Constantine, I mean, it was not such a big jump from there to become a Christian monotheist, but among other things, he knew enough about Christianity to realize that once you were baptized and became a Christian, there were certain things you weren't supposed to do,
right?
Like kill your wife,
like kill your wife, or kill your relatives, or
kill your relatives. Other stuff. So he didn't become a Christian actually until he was on his deathbed, and then he allowed himself to be baptized when he couldn't commit any of these sins anymore.
Yeah, which
kind of does make you wonder about what rulers, the morality of rulers, right?
Yeah,
in general. Yeah. I mean, a lot of them understand that they're going to have to do things that, at least under ordinary circumstances, would be considered extremely sinful. So Constantine becomes a Christian, and one of the reasons clearly he became a Christian and got interested in Christianity was because he thought this is what the Roman Empire needed. There was tremendous demoralization and division in the empire, and a sense that whatever the old gods had done for Rome in the old days, they weren't doing anymore. So that Christianity would become maybe a way of really getting everybody together again, unifying the empire. Then when it turns out in the 320s that the Christians are fighting like crazy among themselves in the very important cities like Alexandria, Constantine is dismayed, and a few of his friends, especially Eusebius of Cordova, the great Spanish bishop, say, listen, you get these bishops together and, get them to, work this out. So Constantine had his own views of this, and it's even unclear at this point, it's unclear how much he tried to dictate, or not. I'm not really sure.
Right, but in
and
any case, but he is able to convene a council that's the first of its kind in many ways, right? Because Christianity could gather in larger numbers, presumably in safety, than it had ever been able to, and it had certainly never been able to gather in the presence of the emperor before.
For sure.
But you can also imagine that all these bishops, many of them who had endured persecution themselves, are still shaking in their boots to be in the presence of the emperor himself. And it's completely unclear, and there's no precedent for, well, does he listen to us on religious matters? Do we listen to him? What's the interchange between our authority and his authority? And this is all being acted out for the very first time.
That's a great way to put it. I wish somebody would do it, I don't know, documentary or something, fictionalize this to see, because it must have been just fascinating for the reasons that you say, to see how this works out. I mean, Constantine's so clever that he comes into this meeting with all these bishops, which, by the way, they called it an ecumenical council, but it really wasn't. It was almost all Eastern Greek-speaking bishops. But anyway, so he gets all the bishops in there, and as you say, a lot of these people still have the bruises on their bodies of having been persecuted. And then he asks for permission to attend the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
He says, would it be all right if I sat down? And they bring him a chair. I mean, this guy was some politician, So he does, and they bring him the chair, and then they have a discussion about it. And there was a lot of division among the bishops. I think they knew what Constantine, how they wanted him, how he was leaning strongly towards the Jesus as God, position. There's no evidence that he dictated to anybody. But maybe his moral authority was enough. I don't know. What we do know is that most of them came to the conclusion that it was necessary to arrive at some formula that would show that Jesus was uniquely holy and it's even hard for me to describe this, because what they did was they didn't find an answer to their question about the status of Jesus vis-a-vis the Father. They couldn't find an answer to it in Jewish or early Christian, which was still Jewish, thinking. So they were all Greek speakers and, the products of Greek education. So they turned to Greek concepts to try to solve their problem, and they found the solution in the Greek word homoousios, which means essentially the same.
Yeah. Same stuff. Same essence.
Same stuff. So a number of bishops said, look, we want everybody at this conference to say that Jesus is of the same stuff as God. And everybody said, okay, except Arius himself and a couple of his pals who were bishops. Mainly from Libya. What's now Libya.
But only a small handful, only like 2 or 3, right?
Very small. But people who had been identified with Arius, who had liked his views, who had told him, who had conferences that said he was Orthodox, all said, okay, fine with us too. And then it turns out, and this is the interesting thing for people like me who are a professor of conflict resolution, about how do you resolve these conflicts? You get this formula. Everybody says, okay, Jesus is of the same stuff as God. Turns out everybody signs it, including people like the Bishop of Nicomedia, the bishop of, all kinds of
And
bishops.
many important known Arian sympathizers
Right.
still agreed to the formula. Arius and his best friends didn't, but even most of his side at the council, and there was a good number of people on his side at the council, still signed on to it. It's, I think, something that a lot of people don't know.
That's right. And I mean, eventually, after years and years, the Arian movement would actually produce people who would say, look, Jesus is not like God.
Mm-hmm.
Or he's similar to God, but really not like. I mean, they would be. That's kind. Well, at this point, nobody was saying that. Everybody was saying, yeah, he's like he's divine, and like God. Well, but the problem was you could sign that if you were an Arian, you could sign that statement, and you could say, well, we never said he wasn't divine.
Right.
We never said he wasn't uniquely, holy.
He's a chip off the old block. So it's the same stuff. Yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I mean, some people even went so far as to say that homoousios, this word for essentially the same, is also the word that's used to describe, say, the similarity between people and animals, between mammals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like human beings are homoousios with, I don't know, bears or something.
Right.
So an Arian could say, well, I mean, we think Jesus is closer to God than a bear is to a human. And it illustrates for people in the conflict resolution business, one of the things that this illustrates is you don't solve these problems by finding a formula.
A verbal propositional formula. Yeah.
That's right. Because everybody's going to, eventually they're going to interpret that formula the way they want to.
Yeah, there's very little such thing as an unambiguous word. And do you think that maybe the word homoousios, which had previously had a not great reputation in the Christian theological tradition, there had been previous councils that had actually outlawed that specific word. Right. Do you think that word was chosen precisely because it was ambiguous and that it served sort of a peacemaking purpose where even most of the Arian sympathizers could be like, well, I guess I could agree to that word if so long as you let me decide what it means to myself.
Yeah, and I think that's a good speculation. I think it's an accurate speculation. And I think that also suggests that they were probably thinking, well, once they've agreed on this, they'll realize the differences aren't that important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, they'll work it out.
Yeah.
So that happened.
So how did it pan out?
It took 70 years for it to happen. Mm-hmm. And in the meanwhile, cities got burned down and people got killed.
And isn't it true that Arius went to Emperor Constantine a year or two after the council and convinced Constantine of his orthodoxy, and so even him and his buddies were readmitted to communion within a year or two after the council. So by a year or two afterwards, no one was out of communion because of the council.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
And then and people have said, what the people have wondered what it would have been like, or how this controversy might have been resolved if the emperors hadn't gotten mixed up in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things Constantine did is by having the conference at Nicaea, he kind of set a precedent for emperors holding ecumenical conferences, and Constantine's son and Constantius was an Arian.
Yeah.
So what you get is this kind of dizzying succession of ecumenical councils reversing each other.
Right.
In fact, and the Roman Catholic Church is sort of eliminated all reference to all of these Arian councils, but there were a lot of them.
Right, and seemingly ones that were just as big, that were just as well representative geographically, that the emperor was in attendance, and that by all appearances at the time looked just as official as perhaps the Council of Nicaea or later the Council of Constantinople. And that the only reason why I could think that you wouldn't consider them ecumenical is because you didn't like their conclusion. But then if you're deciding on the authority of councils based off of their conclusion, then that seems to be putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, no, in fact, they were more ecumenical.
Yeah.
I mean, the Council of Rimini Seleucia
Mm-hmm.
was, I mean, at Nicaea, there were, I don't know what, 200-300 bishops. At Rimini, there were, I don't know, 600.
Yeah. Yeah, and could tell the specific story of that one, because I think that's fascinating. That council's even perhaps more interesting, and like the Wikipedia page barely has any information on it. It's still relatively unknown, and to me, it seemed like that one almost should have worked, but I don't know quite why it didn't. So yeah, if you could tell the story of that one a little bit, I think that would be good.
I don't even remember it that well, except they got it. It was really ecumenical in the sense that they, for once, had major representation from Western and Eastern Rome. And of course, in hindsight, we know now that it wasn't not too long after this that the Eastern and Western churches, who had in some ways were stopping already communicating in a way that they should, were going to be opposing each other. And finally breaking up the unity. But in Rimini Seleucia, I'm trying to remember who the emperor was.
I think it was one of the ones who was like Arian, but a pretty moderate Arian, and was relatively inclined to be a peacemaker, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, and I have my book. Trouble is, I haven't read my book for a while.
That's okay. I understand.
And so basically, what that council, the creed that council, I mean, the final act of all of these councils would be to come up with some creed that everybody could sign, or that they would be forced out of. They would lose their job. Basically, they would lose their seat, their position, if they didn't sign. And in Rimini Seleucia, the creed, as you say, was a relatively moderate Arian. It was an Arian creed that it was not in the hands of the kind of radical Arians.
Right.
And they were saying Jesus is a whole lot like God, was basically what they were saying.
Right, and it wasn't the vindictive Arians who were trying to get back at the Nicenes. It was the relatively amicable Arians who thought, let's just say Jesus is like God. Who could disagree with that, right?
Well, that was the council, though. It was such a big one, and as you say, it looked like that might be the last council. That it was Jerome in Palestine who said the world awoke after that council as after a drunken party to discover that it had become Arian.
So you have this back and forth, right? So Constantine, he has his council. It has some amount of unanimity, but then he will die, and then it passes on to his son, and then they die, and then sometimes there's a small civil war to figure out who gets to be the next emperor, that usual sort of thing. And then sometimes the son would be in favor of the Nicenes, sometimes he would be in favor of the Arians. And I think you start the book, and I think that people really need to get a sense of how ugly this really was on the street. There was Bishop George of Alexandria, who had been planted as the new Bishop of Alexandria by some Arians.
Yeah.
And then his patron emperor dies. And yes. I guess you could pick up the story from there, and just to give people a sense of what this was really like.
Yeah, well, George, for one thing, was a Cappadocian. He was from Turkey. And Turkey, when we say Turkey now, everybody thinks, well, someplace in the Middle East, kind of on a relatively obscure Middle Eastern country, but it was the heartland of Christian, one of the great Christian heartlands. And so anyway, George was from Cappadocia. He was made made Bishop of Alexandria at a time when Athanasius had been exiled again. Athanasius was thrown out of his office 5 times. And so he headed to, went into the countryside and, hid out there. George, as you say, his patron emperor died. And at the point that he died, what everybody in Alexandria could agree on was they didn't like him, or his friends. So Athanasius' supporters basically made common cause with the anti-Christian, with the pagans. And George was being held in prison. So they basically busted him out of prison and lynched him. They put him on a camel. They rode him around. They killed him. Then they burned his body. They destroyed his body, so nobody could use any of his remains as
relics or
as saintly remains to work in. And he was a big deal. This is a guy, George, who had actually been the tutor to the future emperor Julian. And so when Julian finally became emperor, which is not long after this, and Julian was asked, well, what are you going to do about, having your old teacher, George, got lynched? Julian said, that wasn't a good thing.
Yeah.
And that was the end of that. I mean, he wasn't going to punish anybody for it.
And that's a common theme in these sorts of ideological conflicts, is that they'll have their figureheads, and then there's sort of the violent fringe that they don't fully acknowledge as being representative of them, but they also know that they can kind of get that violent fringe to do their bidding with some amount of plausible deniability. And so in the streets of Alexandria, Antioch, and all of these places, there would just be these mobs that would attack each other or desecrate a church or take a bishop and lynch him and drag his remains through the city and then burn his body afterwards.
That's right.
And all of these sorts of things that are almost unconscionable to think of from Christians doing to each other. But this was, during this century, was relatively common, and it seems like hundreds or thousands or even maybe tens of thousands of people died in these sorts of conflicts.
Yeah, there's no accurate count of casualties that I know of, but there have got to have been a lot, because, and I think it's important to emphasize this, because that this was a society which was in some ways it was elite dominated. I mean, clearly there were enormously powerful figures. There were aristocrats. There were generals and and so forth, who had more power than most people did. But it was also a society where, really ever since the beginning of Christianity, if not before, the common people were used to expressing themselves in the streets. In fact, I came across a description. I was reading about Constantinople the other day. I was reading, and they had, Constantinople was divided into parties who identified, it was like soccer gangs, today. They identified with chariot, who they thought was going to win in the chariot race. They were like sports fans.
Yeah.
They also had there were also political implications to like which team you supported. And at the end of the sports events, they would come out and fight it out in the streets.
Yeah. Still happens in Brazil and some parts of the world.
All over the place.
Yeah.
But also, these were people who, it's important to remember, these were people, a lot of them could read and write.
Yeah.
And they could think. They were not sort of just, stupid masses doing whatever stupid masses do. They were people who had ideas. They had favorites. not only in sports, but in theology.
Yeah.
And
And the stakes were very real. Like you talked earlier, like Athanasius, when he was Bishop of Alexandria, one of the things that he got in trouble for, among the many times that he got in trouble, was manipulating the supply of grain such that it went to his allies and failed to get to his enemies.
right.
And Egypt was the largest exporter of grain in the empire. And so that was real power. And like Christian bishops like don't have anywhere near that power in any part of the world that I can think of nowadays. But it wasn't just like an imaginary thing like soccer can sometimes feel. There was very real political and economic stakes for which side wins, and if you're on the side of the person in charge or not.
That's right. That's right. And when I was writing that book, it was not long before that I had spent a long time living in Chicago. Really, the figure, aside from his theological ability, which was enormous, I mean, the figure that Athanasius most reminded me of was Mayor Daley.
Yeah, I live in Chicago or in the suburbs right now. Yeah, I am not quite old enough to remember Richard Daley personally, but I know, like when I was reading that, he seems like a Chicago politician. You know, you have your good face, and you when you're a Chicago style politician, you have to do two contradictory things at once. You have to be tough, where you have a credible threat that you can use against your enemies so that they fear you, but you also have to be such a nice and good person that you would never do those sorts of things, right? And so your enemies have to know that they can fear you, but you have this plausible deniability gap, right? Oh no, that wasn't actually me, but yes, it was me, and if you get on my bad side, I'll do that, but oh no, that wasn't me, right? And Athanasius seems particularly good at that sort of, I'm a holy saint when I need to be, but I'm a rough and tumble gangster theological demagogue if I need to also.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think another thing to do that's useful in this is to think about, in terms of parallels and all, is to think about the fact that the context for this struggle was a situation in which people were experiencing more and more internal conflict. And the Roman Empire was really, in some ways, coming apart. Things had gotten much worse for the poor. And when I say the poor, I mean just farmers, peasant farmers.
Mm-hmm.
Not a handful of poor, lots of
Mm-hmm.
people. Things. You have so-called barbarians on the borders of the empire, non-Romans, who the Romans basically can't deal with. And they finally give them land. They can't really defend the borders. Not only can't they defend the borders, but those people become the backbone of the Roman army. The barbarians, so-called barbarians, become. And you have, even in the same kind of generation that we're talking about, the Arian controversy growing, you have Roman authorities saying, people can't change their jobs anymore. If you're born into this particular, you're born a farmer, you're born a merchant, whatever you're born, you stay there. Because we can't deal with people kind of moving from class to class or moving from group to group. And a general sense that something is seriously wrong, that despite the hopes of Constantine and other people that they would revive the empire, that the empire was really in serious trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question of, well, who to blame and how, what can we do? Is there any way to arrest this decline? Becomes a kind of obsession of lots of people. And so, and how do you live with it? If you can't arrest it, then how do you live with it?
Yeah.
It really, I have to say, it reminds me a lot of what we're going through now.
Mm-hmm.
A feeling that things are out of control in ways that they haven't been out of control before.
Mm-hmm.
And how much do you blame yourself for it, and how much do you blame your leadership for it, and how much do you say the old gods have failed us,
Yeah,
Um,
or your internal ideological enemies. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And also this kind of quest to find somebody to pin it on, find somebody to be responsible for this, because we don't want to really say it's something's wrong with our system.
hmm
So, I mean, among all of the, the Arians fighting the Nicaeans, and we know, of course, that after all this Arian controversy is over, that they're going to fight for another 200 years over. Not, it's not going to be over whether Jesus is God or not, but it's going to be over what does it mean that Jesus is God, and how many natures does he have, and
right. Yeah.
and there's going to be intense conflict. Um, so, uh, so kind of the question that doesn't get asked is, how is our system let us down, and what is there a better system that can we either stop being an empire, or can we stop being this kind of an empire and do this a different way? Nobody wants to talk about that, and it in some ways that's still a taboo discussion.
Yeah, that's
If,
interesting.
you know,
So I wanna try and draw the Arian story to a close.
yeah,
So there's the Council of Nicaea, then there's a couple decades of somewhat quiet while Constantine's still alive. And then there's this period of time where his sons and grandchildren and grandnephews and whatever fight, and kind of flips back and forth. And I think in the background, at the same time, while there's real political battles, the theological lines are sharpening, right? I think part of the problem was that in the beginning, a lot of the theological lines were blurry, right? There was a lot of questions that had never really been asked or needed to be clarified before. But a couple decades of that, and things get really polarized, and each ideological side has sharp corners. And I think, like you said, some of the problems of Arianism is, so what exactly is Jesus? Is he an angel, a super angel, a demigod, a second god? And then, well, none of those answers seem very satisfying. And how exactly do you think you can worship him if he isn't God himself, right? And then the other side, well, no, he's just as God the Father. But then that question brings up, well, wait a minute, so you have two gods? That's one God too many. We're only allowed to have one God, and if Jesus is that God, then who's the Father? Where'd he go to? And I think that you bring a really good point, that if you're going to make Jesus God, then there is a second consequence to that you not only need to redefine Jesus, you also need to redefine God. And so if you could talk a little bit about sort of the Cappadocian Fathers, and sort of maybe the build up to the final council of the Council of Constantinople, and sort of how this sort of draws to a close.
yeah. Well, the Cappadocian Fathers come along just at the right time. It looks as though, I mean, really, if you want to ask how the Arian controversy ended, there were really three parts of it. The first part that you just pointed to, in some ways, in long-term terms, the most important, is that the Cappadocian Fathers, who are Basil the Great and Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa, basically invent a new vocabulary. They say it's just a fascinating development, which I keep wondering why more hasn't been made of this, especially these days, by people we've all become very interested in language. And in my field, in conflict resolution, the whole idea of narrative and methods of narrative is being kind of key to analyzing what's causing conflict and how it can be resolved. Is now we're starting to accept that, but one of the earliest examples that I know of this is that the Cappadocian Fathers say, look, if people up to this time Part of the problem has been that when you talk about the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, because by the time the Cappadocians come along, the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, the issue around, well, what is the Holy Spirit, and is that a separate aspect of God, or is it a separate person, or what is it, has become a subject of debate. And when the Cappadocian Fathers, when people look back at the Nicene Council, the Council of Nicaea, they saw that among the other things that were banned at Nicaea, the other anathemas, there was anathema against, the Nicaea said, don't talk about Christ and God as being separate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, come on, they're the same. They're, you know, they're made of the same stuff. Well, some people were saying, yes, but they're, in some ways, they're separate too. And the Council of Nicaea was saying, well, don't talk about that, basically. Don't talk about separate persons.
Mm-hmm.
That's anathema too. Well, so the Nicene Fathers said, well, look, linguistically, we can solve some of these problems by saying that Christ and God are essentially the same, but they're not identical. It needn't lower Jesus to a subordinate position if we recognize that he is a separate entity in some ways from God. But it's complicated because if he's really separate, then he's not God. So how do you express this idea that he is separate but not essentially separate?
Right.
And they basically come up with some language.
Mm-hmm.
They say it is okay to say that he's a separate person,
Mm-hmm.
but persona. But you know, and this, let me say that this does not solve all the problems, because persona also means mask.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Cappadocian Fathers were not saying he's just an aspect of God or just a mask of God, that he really has his own individuality. I mean, this was what Athanasius had said from the beginning, is that he's really a person, a human, but he's also really God. And people saying, well, how the hell can that be true? How can those two things be true? Well, the Cappadocian Fathers don't solve that problem. They say how it's true is a mystery.
Right.
But it is true.
Right.
And here's language, at least, which kind of makes linguistic sense of it.
Right. And we have language for how they're different. We have language for how they're the same. But perhaps in the final analysis, there isn't any strict propositional formula for how to reconcile that both difference and similitude. And so there's a mystery at the core, but here are words about how they're different. Here's the words about how they're the same. And that's how we'll talk about it. And that's really sort of the distinctive Trinitarian solution.
That's right.
That is still passed on to this day.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Now, if they had simply come up with this solution and nothing else had happened, I'm not sure it would have taken, you know.
Yeah.
But other things happened. One thing that happened was the Roman army got wiped out at Hadrianopolis. A Roman army led by an Arian emperor, Valens. They never even discovered this guy's body. Mm-hmm. It was the worst defeat that the Romans suffered at the hands of non-Romans, maybe ever. And immediately, St. Ambrose, who was in Milan at the time, said, this is God's judgment on the Arians.
Right, that same idea we talked about earlier, that you could see God's opinion on things based off of the fate and course of history.
Exactly. And the other thing was that old man Athanasius, who everybody had assumed was an absolute, dogmatist when it would come to this, that he would never make peace with anybody calling themselves an Arian, that he turns out to be a better politician even than anybody knew. And he holds out he makes peace with the conservative Arians.
Yeah, well, a good Chicago politician knows when it's time to, be pragmatic, I guess, right?
Exactly. And but I mean, Athanasius does that on the feeling. Actually, it turned out, accurately, that if he basically stopped hounding them for a little while, they would basically come around to where he was anyway.
Right. And I think that's also part of the Cappadocian formula, is that it takes some of the language and ideas of Arianism, some of the language and ideas of Athanasius and pro-Nicaeism, and kind of fuses them together and says, well, don't read the fine print, but these things are now together. And that it is something, I think that a lot of Trinitarians don't realize that in the final analysis, I think Trinitarianism is essentially a compromise and an attempted reconciliation of what probably just are two irreconcilable ideas. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, I do think that's right. And I wrote later on, after I did this book, I wrote a book about called Aristotle's Children, about the Catholic, the kind of intellectual revolution of the Middle Ages, where Catholicism accepted Aristotle, a lot of Aristotle's ideas, and was led by great Aristotelians like Thomas Aquinas. One of the things I said in that book is that if I was I wrote a chapter about Peter Abelard. Abelard's mistake was to try to make sense of the Trinitarian doctrine.
Not the first, not the last. Yeah.
That was the end of it. Basically that was the end of his career.
Right. And that's something that you also mentioned in the book, is that the Arians tended to be a little bit more in favor of reason and philosophical argument. And the pro-Niceans tended to be a little more Mysterian, right? That God is a little bit more mysterious than we can imagine. And if things don't make sense, that's not his fault. And Peter Abelard was very much in that very kind of rationalistic, we'll figure this out. All we need to do is put our minds to it, and we can get our hands around it. And that got him in a lot of trouble. And it was over the Trinity question again.
Yeah, the Trinity question, that was the electric rail.
Still is.
The theologians.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's interesting. And I guess one sort of question is, it seems like, so in 381 there's the Council of Constantinople, and I think your book portrays it this way, and I think a lot of people agree that it was sort of a preordained council, in that only those who were known to be compliant with the foreordained conclusion were allowed to attend. And it wasn't a very large attendance, and it wasn't a very geographically representative attendance. So unlike some of the councils that had been previously happened in the couple decades that people have forgotten about. Yeah. But it sort of rubber stamps, the Cappadocian formula. Gregory of Nazianzus presides over it. Although I think didn't he resign in disgust or something like that?
Yeah, he did. He didn't like Theodosius.
Yeah. and then so once this is sort of finalized, then Theodosius, with a fervor that without precedent, suddenly puts a lot of military and effort into wiping out all alternatives within the empire and sort of cleansing it of any dissent.
Yeah, as long as it lasted, which wasn't long, but yes. And I think, he probably read the situation correctly, because I think, as I think I said also in the book, that that if you persecute Christians, that doesn't necessarily convince them that they're wrong. But somehow Theodosius get tough stuff that he did convince people, or else people went along with it. And I think people had had enough of this controversy by this time, and this was this is 381, the Council of Constantinople, and what, 30 years later, Rome was going to be sacked,
Yeah.
By whoever.
Although the ideological fervor didn't stop just with Arians. First, they came for the Arians, but then there was also, kind of pogroms against Jews and the sort of public rape murder of Hypatia and Alexandria and stuff like that, that seemed to usher in a degree of ideological intolerance that seemed relatively new and pretty brutal.
Yes, you're right. And, what James Carroll talks about that in his and Constantine's Sword, and other people have talked about it. And it is brutal. And I mean, the process by which, and this is not to excuse it by any means, but the process by which a new ideology finally becomes the kind of officially accepted. This is the new orthodoxy in a very diverse, culturally diverse place like Rome is going to be brutal.
Yeah.
And, and it was.
Mm-hmm.
But then, what's fascinating too is that this then unleashes another, couple of centuries of continuing controversy, which is so nasty that Paul Johnson, the conservative historian of Christianity, comes along and says I think maybe that's why the Muslims did so well when when the Muslims invaded the whole area, basically, when Islam invaded the area. Johnson is, in fact, he's one of the few historians of Christianity that I know who say this, but he says that he thinks people were exhausted by these continual controversies, and also that the Muslims represented in some ways the old-time religion, old-time monotheism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they're saying, well, we'll put an end to that. We think Jesus was,
a
divine
prophet.
too.
Yeah.
He was a great prophet too. And that's it. That's the end of that.
And it's just simpler. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's as simpler as right.
Yeah. So there are a lot of parallels, I think, that can be drawn between the 4th century and ours. America can sometimes a little bit feel nowadays like an empire that is worried about its future and worried about decline and decadence. And we seem to be increasingly ideologically divided and polarized over what I'm sure in future centuries will look like completely bizarre and trivial minutia, like which lives matter and other sorts of things that'll be hard to explain, whether or not to wear masks. And it just seems like every new crisis that we meet immediately becomes polarized and symbolized along the kind of already pre-drawn battle lines. So how do we avoid a fate sort of like the Roman Empire under these Christological disputations, where just every new detail kept driving a wedge between the population that led to street battles and schisms and civil wars, etc.?
Yeah, very good question, and not an easy answer. I think that what that from our perspective, first thing to do is recognize how serious these internal conflicts are. We have when you look at Rome, at the decline of Rome, and this, you can look at Gibbon even on the decline and fall of Rome, or read some of the new stuff. There's a lot of very good material now about the decline of Rome. And one of the things that all these people are emphasizing is that the problem was not so much the external threat to Rome. That there were problems, Germanic tribes and all of that business. But
and the continual Persians, there's always the Persians.
The Parthians, right? The Parthians. But that what was really ripping the society apart was internal.
Mm-hmm. Also sounds familiar. we still hate the Russians, but really our biggest enemies is not the Russians, but if the Russians help the other side.
Right. So you get the tribal, this kind of tribal, neo-tribal, tribalism I've been calling, kind of conflict. And then it's tricky and difficult to have a conversation about what's really causing it. I mean, if we are tribes, and I think we really are. I mean, I think more and more you can't, in conflict in our country, but also in other countries around the world, more and more resembles ethnic or religious conflict. And it's not the old time political, we're not disagreeing about policy so much as we are in disagreeing about values and what kind of people we are versus what kind of people you are,
Yeah.
So if that's happening, it seems to me that that's being generated by various systems that are in trouble, that are in crisis. And they include the socioeconomic system, and they include the political system, and they include cultural systems too. And it's very hard to talk about those systems because in some ways it's taboo to talk about them. You're not supposed to say what's wrong with American democracy, what's wrong with American capitalism, what's wrong with, fill in the blanks. And I wrote a book a couple of years ago about this called Resolving Structural Conflict. And I think that that's really what we most need, what I feel like we most need to do now is to talk about what are these systems that we're part of. There's a kind of primitive way to talk about it. It's not like people aren't that stupid. I mean, people recognize that there are systems operating to their disadvantage. But there's a kind of tendency to then to try to discover, a deep state or this, that, or the other thing, to try to lay it on somebody, which kind of cuts off the conversation about what's really going on. And so in my role as a kind of conflict resolution person, I'm thinking more and more, and I'm trying more and more to facilitate conversations between people about what is this system that's kind of got us in our grip, and what's wrong with it. I mean, we have more social inequality in this society than any other industrialized state. So that's okay. Well, what about that? I mean, everybody kind of knows that. People who are for Donald Trump know it. People who are against Donald Trump know it. But they don't seem to be able to talk about it in a way that gets us anywhere. So I don't know. So that's where I'm at now, is trying to. We have what I'm calling an online teach-in coming up on the 26th of October. We're going to talk about the coming elections, the potential for civil violence, and where is all this conflict coming from? And I'm not interested in this, in having it become a Trump bashing or a Trump praising, event. I want to try to help myself and other people talk about, what has got us at each other's throats. If it isn't just, if in conflict resolution, if you ask anybody in a serious conflict, what do you think is really the cause of this conflict? And they haven't had much chance to think about it yet, they will always say the other side is the cause of the conflict. It's them,
Yeah.
They're so this, they're so that, and we're okay and they're not. And that's the cause of the conflict. Well, that's not the cause of the conflict. So, for example, we are an empire. I mean, that shouldn't really be open to debate anymore. Of course, we have troops in 120 countries. Of course, we're an empire. That should be the beginning of the discussion, right? But do we want to be? Do we want to be this kind of an empire? What should our role in the world be? And that actually is one issue on which I feel myself in some ways closer to Trump than his opponents, because at least he recognizes he recognized we can't go on fighting wars against everybody forever. On the other hand, if you want to say, is America basically, what kind of society is this, and what kind do we want it to be? The truth of the matter is, we really haven't been asked.
Yeah.
That's not a question that people get asked. How do you want to, So sometimes I think we're really at the beginning of what's going to be could be a tremendously creative period for our people, where we figure out where we're at and where we want to be.
Yeah.
But the forms of democracy, the forms of economic enterprise, the forms of kind of political expression that we've inherited don't really lend themselves very well to this kind of discussion. So I'm feeling more and more we got to improvise. We have to improvise new ways of talking about these things.
Yeah.
And I think I have to say, to get back to the religion theme again, I think religion's got a really important role to play in this. Because really we're talking about what kind of people we want to be and what kind of society, what kind of social values we want to uphold. And it's time to stop calling each other's names on that, and actually see if we can come to some kind of agreement about it. But it's difficult. Well, you understand as well as I do why it's difficult.
Yeah. So I have one last topic to ask you about.
Sure.
And so you're working on a book on Paul, and if there is one religious conflict that is even more bitter and older than the Arian conflict within Christianity, it's the conflict between Christianity and Judaism. And that we talked about it briefly, that it seemed like right at the end of the Arian conflict, there was sort of a new wave and era of Christian persecution of Judaism. And I don't even really know exactly. So when I have theological conversations with Jews, Paul is a hot topic. Paul is almost too hot of a potato to handle sometimes, because he seems right there at the root of this thing. So what are you focusing on Paul, and is there any hope that we can have for helping to make amends and healing the perhaps one of the oldest and bitterest religious conflicts still around?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's an explosion of interest in Paul, as you probably know. I mean, tremendous. I'm in my library here. If I could show you, the back wall of this is practically all Paul books.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things about Paul that's so interesting, and is that certainly a change in a change in Paul's scholarship, big change in Paul's scholarship, is that there is now a great appreciation of him as a Jewish thinker.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've talked not only to Jewish friends, but also Christian friends. In fact, one of my best friends is a nun in Chicago, who's now moved up in our direction, who when I told her I was doing a book on Paul, she said, no comment. And what she had in mind was Paul's attitude towards women.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's Paul's attitude towards Paul's attitude. Anyway, I think one of the key things about Paul that's interesting to talk about and think about now is that Paul is a serious apocalyptic thinker.
Yes.
I mean, Paul really expected the great change to come in his own lifetime.
Yeah, apocalyptic in both senses of the word. He had revealed visions to himself, and he thought that the culmination of all things was nigh. Yeah.
Right. And the culmination of all things, though, if you don't, before you get too, I don't know, Einsteinian about it and interpret the apocalypse in terms of the end of space and time, I really don't think. I think Paul was much more Jewish than that. I think most of the new Paul scholars think so too. That he's talking about a new historical phase,
Yeah.
which will be, to be sure, will be different than anything that's ever gone before, but doesn't take us out of history. It culminates history
And makes history almost hyper real or something.
Exactly. So that means the end of the Roman model, if you want to put it that way, of social, political, ethical organization. If he had talked directly about that, he wouldn't have lived. He wouldn't have lived a week if he had said that too plainly.
So and he had a hard enough time staying alive as it was.
Absolutely. So either the Romans were beating him up, or the Jews were. Somebody was beating him up. And finally, he finally loses his life after getting shipwrecked in Malta and then going to Rome. So there are lots of interesting questions about that, and there, I think there's a reason that Paul is being read very seriously by all sorts of people, including kind of radical politicians in Europe and that sort of thing, because I think they see him much more now as somebody who is talking about a radically new historical phase.
Yeah.
The kingdom is not so. I was in it'll take us too long to talk about this, but I was in a discussion yesterday with a priest, with an Episcopal priest, who said, well, Paul taught us that the kingdom of God is, Jesus taught us, and then Paul re-emphasized that the kingdom of God is within, right? And I said, no, it's the kingdom of God is within, but the kingdom of God is also about to come into existence without.
Yes.
It's not an either or, within or without. When you start talking about the either or within, what you're doing at that point is saying, well, we've given up kind of on the great.
And Paul thought the within was the foreshadow of the without.
Absolutely.
That's what our faith is. It's tasting now what is soon to come. Absolutely. Internally, what will be explicit, and it's esoteric first, exoteric second.
Absolutely. So how much of an enemy Paul is to Judaism, I don't think of him that way at all. I have to say, I'm not Orthodox. Maybe that's why I don't think of it that way. But yes, circumcision is not such a big deal, and you don't have to keep code. Although actually, he said if you were Jewish, you should do do it. But the idea that that's not, when he says in Christ there's no more Jew there's no more Jew or Greek, there's no more man
male,
or
female, slave
no
free,
more slave or master. And what does that mean? It means that there's a potential for a new kind of equality,
a radical equality of apocalyptic significance. Yeah.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to that book. Is it nonfiction or is it fiction?
I'm writing it as a novel.
Because
I wanted to try to picture Paul as a guy.
Yeah.
And because he spent several months in Malta, that nobody knows what he did while he was there, and I thought it would be fun to imagine. what he did while he was there, but because he's such to me at least, he's such an appealing personality in some ways. I think also a pain in the neck,
Yeah,
if in others,
I imagine so.
if you were, palling around with him. I just think, anyway, that's so I'm trying to do this as a novel. I've got a part of it written. We'll see if it
Yeah,
works.
you lived in Malta for a while, right?
I did, yes.
Yeah. Well, so that I can see and understand how that would have some rich personal significance.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, I really look forward to reading that book. Maybe I'll have you on again to talk about that. But your book, When Jesus Became God, I really can't recommend highly enough. It's extremely readable, extremely enjoyable, and I think it's a period of history that too many people know too little about, and that is starting to have eerie resonances with our own time, as we already discussed. So, Dr. Rubenstein, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me, and you understand that book better than anybody I've ever talked to about it. So it was a real pleasure talking to you about it.
Well, thank you. That's quite a high compliment.
Okay, you take care.
You take care.